Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I was born in Lahore and I grew up in Peshawar. And I came back to Lahore to go to college. I went to Kinnaid College. And then I went to Reed College in the US and I graduated from there. And about 10 years ago, I finished my MFA. I started off as being a literature and psychology major, both here at Kinnaid and at Reed College. And then I just shifted my goals, and I did a creative thesis at Reed, and I took my poems more seriously, and I gave up my psychology, my ambitions to be a psychologist. I have also written essays. So in the past 5 to 7 years, I've published essays, and many of them are lyric essays. They're sort of memoir essays, and some of them are critical essays. So they explore the literary tradition of Urdu and English and intersections between different literary traditions. So my latest book, in fact, is a book of poems and essays. It's a hybrid book, and it combines both literary forms. Well, you use the word connect, and I think that's precisely what I think I've been trying to do, is to connect different traditions, different cultures. As you know, growing up in Pakistan, we read English literature, and we're exposed to traditions other than the Urdu tradition, whether it's this culture, provincial culture, literatures of the provincial languages. Many of them are older, much older than Urdu. Growing up, I was very interested in multiple traditions. I grew up with multiple traditions. And so in school, I studied English literature. And at home, I was exposed to Persian literature and Urdu literature. And then I grew up hearing the sound of Pashto and Punjabi and all that. So I was very interested in how these traditions over centuries have, how they've come together, how they have interacted, how they have conflicted, and how they've generated literary traditions. So since I was in school, I was fascinated by all of these influences coming together. And because Pakistan was part of the British Raj, we sort of inherited English as well. We have our own tradition of literature in English. We have a Pakistani English literary tradition. So just all of this is very interesting. And when I went abroad to study, I sort of received a different perspective from, America in the 90s, how we Pakistanis, Muslims, Muslim women were viewed by the West. And that was something new to me. And that sort of, again, that interaction sort of provoked more questions and more the lesson was to keep thinking about it and keep trying to explore further and further why, why there's such a lapse of understanding on that side. It's mostly on that side, not on this side. I think the reason is that in Pakistan, first of all, we are familiar with the Western literary tradition and the entertainment. We grew up watching Hollywood movies here, and we knew Bruce Springsteen and Michael Jackson and all that. So we were very familiar with that tradition, whether it's the modern pop tradition or the classical tradition, the literary tradition. You read Milton and Byron and Keats and all that. So you sort of have an idea of the tradition in general. But in the US, I felt like nobody really knew about our tradition, not just the Pakistani tradition, but the Eastern tradition in general. Until recently, until I'd say like maybe 10, 15 years ago, people didn't know who Rumi was. And so it's very recent that Rumi has become a mainstream American poet. So people read Rumi, quote Rumi all the time because he was translated, and he became sort of part of mainstream poetry readership. I think because we have an analytical mind and we respond to the world analytically, but then for poets, we really like to, our compass really is our own spirit. And we like to, I believe that real poetry really comes from your spirit. It has to be your, a response to your own experience, a response to, your own sort of inner exploration. So it's a little bit of both. And I think some of my work in prose addresses what you call the more conscious effort to bridge the gaps of understanding and knowing. And the spiritual side of it, or the poetic side of it, really is a matter of having, I always think it's like loud thinking, like I'm talking to myself, because I'm trying to clarify emotions and just, even if it's an intellectual response, it's really an inner dialogue. And when it's on paper, when I'm trying to craft a poem, when it gets published, it is a sort of a journey of discovery and exploration, and it's not really premeditated. Well, an essay would be, is something that when I'm writing an essay, something that I would, when you have an argument, and then you want to give evidence, and that's a different part of the mind that's at work. So that's the more conscious part. That actually has been very useful in having conversations with people in the past decade or so, or more than a decade, that we've had these troubles between, loosely speaking, the East and the West. So, to put it into clear words in the form of an essay really helps to sort of convey those or to point out misconceptions, or to convey information. In poetry is not really a good way to convey information, because the use of poetry is that it gives the reader emotional information, and that is a very good way of bridging gaps. When in a poem you talk about what makes you vulnerable, what you're afraid of, what you're attached to, so many of those things, most of those things are just human emotions and human concerns. And that's a very good way that's how poetry bridges gaps between cultures, between people, even between different historical periods. I read Ghalib now, and Ghalib talks about feeling isolated, and I'm not living in 19th century Mughal India, but I know how he feels. And when he talks about how his response to the destruction of Delhi, in the war, so I know I can relate to those experiences, because those things are also happening now. So I have translated Urdu poetry into English. I've done some translations of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, but because I'm a poet myself, I resist the urge. I feel that translation is a service. It's a very important service. It's a very useful service, and each translation, even if it brings a nuanced sort of I want to say sensation to the poem. It's a nuanced meaning. It's a nuanced sense. It's a nuanced sensation, and that's important. So they will have a range of different translations, and they could all be incorrect. They could all be correct. There is no such thing as correct or incorrect translation. I believe translation is important. I believe translation is impossible where poetry is concerned. I believe it's a service, and I am not particularly, at the moment I do have translation projects in mind, Again, I approach them that way. Because I'm a poet, I feel especially strongly that, one has to have a very open mind where translation is concerned. We attempt translations, and we do our best with them. So my work has been translated. The only one that I can comment on is the work that has been translated into Urdu. But the poets who translated my work into Turkish, I've had conversations with them. They're brilliant poets, and I don't have a doubt that the poems are well translated. My poems have also been translated into Spanish. Again, when I talk to these poets, because they're poets, I know that when you're being translated by a prose, I don't know how that would be, because all my work's been translated by poets. So I trust them, and I know that they're doing their best. The one that I can comment on that was done in Urdu recently, it was a ghazal. So the original ghazal is in English. Right. And it was translated into Urdu by Khurram Khiram Siddiqui Saab. And it's a beautiful translation. So he took my ghazal and he translated it into a ghazal in Urdu, which is quite it's very difficult to take a poem that's been written in a particular form and then write use a different language and use the same form. And I was very pleased with that. I was very honored. My work has been published in Pakistani anthologies. So Pakistan Academy of Letters has been doing, actually I was published more than 10 years ago, I think, but 12 years ago, or maybe even longer than that. So they published a few anthologies. There's one that is an anthology of Pakistani women's writings. And then there's one that's Pakistani writing in English, and so on. So my poems in translation were published then as well, in Urdu translation. So other people have translated my work. Those poems are not ghazals. That's been around. And then there's Alif Review and a few other publications in Pakistan that include my work. I think one can compare the work of an editor to what you do, which is you're a curator. You curate the series. It's a very impressive series, and what you achieve is that you try to bring out all the hidden nuances and all the things that are not easy to understand from the work, and you get the you try to find angles in the work that may be concealed. Yes. And this is exactly what an editor does. That you have work in front of you, and you find you sort of become experienced in looking for those things that are important to be heard, and of course in that particular work the person is able to say those things in a way that will stay with the reader, and then curating the whole thing, bringing work like that together, work that sort of makes sense as a series, so I think with editing, again, it's a matter of deep reading, being sensitive to what needs to be said right now. But there's another angle personally that I'm interested in, and that is our relationship to tradition. So of course, it's important to hear and to say what is relevant right now, but it's also important to stay connected with our history and with our tradition. And there's a fear that I have. I think that fear comes from being a Pakistani, is because Pakistan is such a new country, and because we have been cut off from our larger tradition. As Muslims of Indo-Pakistan, who've been around for 700-800 years, that our tradition is so much longer than the 70 some years of being Pakistanis. So a preservation of tradition and then a nuanced understanding of tradition, trying to regenerate and to refresh, but also to gain a deeper understanding of tradition, of the old texts, reading and rereading and interpreting and sharing, all of that. As an editor, it's important for me that any work, it doesn't have to be work from Pakistan, any work, it could be work from, because I'm an immigrant in the US, I'm very interested in poets who are immigrants in the US and who engage with their own traditions. So they are speaking in an environment, they're speaking to the here and now, but they're also connecting what they say to their tradition, be it the Chinese tradition or the Palestinian tradition or the Persian tradition or the Indian tradition or the Pakistani tradition. And I think that is very enriching in the US. I feel that a poet writing in the US, I think that immigrant poetry is really enriching the American tradition. I think this is a great time for writers and artists of other kinds as well, because finally, the narrative is in our own hands, and partly due to the fact that we converse in European languages as well, and because we were colonies, 100 years ago. As we address our tradition, as we address contemporary reality, as we address colonialism and post-colonialism, we are coming up with a new language. We're coining a new language, which includes the commentary that we received, what is called the Orientalist commentary. So we are responding to that, and as we respond, we're creating a new tradition of, creating, being the speakers of being the protagonists of our own story, and being the narrators of our own histories. So yeah, absolutely. I think that around the world, and especially in the West now, it's very exciting to see that we have such a diversity of voices